Canada's combat operations in Afghanistan are set to expire in 14 months. Word is Canadian soldiers may trade fighting the war in Afghanistan for a United Nations mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The mission would be a return of sorts to our peacekeeping roots of the past few decades, which might be more palatable to those Canadians uncomfortable with our combat operations in Central Asia. But are Canadians ready to let their soldiers get mixed up in a dirty civil war like the Congo, where 4 million people have already died? Or is the call to get out of Afghanistan indicative of a broader desire to withdraw from global conflict? What's next for our armed forces after Afghanistan? That's tonight on the agenda, live from the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin. Funding for The Agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Vale Inco Limited, a pioneering nickel mining company transforming mineral resources into essential ingredients for everyday life. Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at casforchange.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and we welcome you to the newly christened Munk School of Global Affairs, where we gather on the last Thursday of every month for a special broadcast. Joining us now to debate Canada's military role after Afghanistan, Pamela Wallin, Conservative Senator and Chair of the Senate's National Security and Defense Committee. David Bercuson, Director of the Centre for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. Roland, Chair in International Security and Governance at the University of Ottawa. Steve Staples, Director of the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. And Janice Stein, TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst, Director of this Munk School, and someone for whom the hits just keep on coming. Another press release today, Janice? More money? This time from Stephen Harper.
That's right, to create a Canada Centre for Global Security Studies right here at the Munk School. So this discussion tonight is just perfect.
So you got money from Dalton McGuinty, money from Stephen Harper, money from Peter Munk. Are you taking collection plate after the evening is over, or how does that work?
No, but we're going to create a wonderful school with our partners, which I hope will be an asset for the whole country.
Gotcha. Let's start with this. We want to explore, after nearly 10 years of having our troops in Afghanistan, what kind of armed forces we now have. In other words, Senator Wallin, to you first, what kind of capabilities do our forces now have, having spent 10 years there, that we didn't have before?
Well, I think we've seen a complete transformation of the Canadian forces in this country, and I think it's a good thing. We went for more than a decade in this country where they were so underfunded. We've all heard Rick Hillier refer to this as the decade of darkness. And I think we've seen this as a transformation as the force now moves into a true fighting force, belatedly getting some equipment, but equipment is there nevertheless, the right kind of gear, the right kind of kit. And I've had the opportunity to meet senior officials, NATO, UN, Stanley McChrystal, you name it, people who are watching and working alongside us. And their description of what the Canadian forces are doing in Afghanistan is that they are both the brains and the heart of the operation. So when you're getting that from your allies internationally, you know that you're doing something right.
David Bercuson, what capabilities do we now have that we didn't have a decade ago?
Well, a decade ago, I would say that we were, I'll say, a shadow of a legacy Cold War military, because that's what we were up to 1990, and there was very little change in the military during the 90s, partly because of the budget cuts. Also because the military itself wasn't really thinking about renewal and moving forward with a different agenda. I would say today our forces are faster, are lighter, more mobile, and especially they're much smarter. They think a lot better than they did. We've got one of the best educated officer corps in the world. And these people really are plugged in to what's going on, the new social media, the whole thing. So I think it's a much better military.
Roland, how would you answer that?
They are definitely more skilled and better equipped and extremely highly trained now. I mean, we talk about there being just under 3,000 Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan, but if you consider the number that have cycled through over the last several years. I think it's over 14,000 Canadian troops have served in Afghanistan in a very complex environment. So we have this remarkably highly skilled, probably the most highly skilled and best equipped force now than we've had for decades. The other thing that they've had experience doing in Afghanistan is working with the civilian parts of the Canadian government, which has been absolutely necessary. Now, there have been areas of success and failure in that, but certainly it has gone beyond what we've seen before, and that's crucial because the kind of environments where the Canadian forces might be operating in the future will require combined security and civilian activities, and that will mean integrated efforts between civilian departments and development workers and civilian technical experts and military all working together.
Steve Staples.
Well, Stephen, I think in terms of, I look at it in terms of political power right now. And I think in Ottawa, the military has incredible political footprint there. Nobody is prepared to kind of say no to the military in terms of money, in terms of equipment. And really, we've all heard about lots of equipment, but equipment, was it the right equipment? We have a fleet of tanks right now that were about to be mothballed that were designed for the Cold War, and now we have 120 of them. We have 2 fleets of aircraft that do essentially the same thing, largely driven by special interests in Ottawa. And I'm really concerned that we have a military that's much more secretive, has been spending a lot more money than it ever has been, and is really just better suited to fight a combat role in Afghanistan alongside the United States. And I think the test is going to be, can that military be used for something else?
Janice.
No, I disagree with Steve. I think it's actually quite interesting, the transformation in the military, because it's very real. It was a Cold War military. It focused on armor. It wasn't flexible. It wasn't nimble. And what you actually have now is a fighting force, much more nimble, much quicker. Yes, it has tanks, but it doesn't engage in armored warfare. So and that's a very big difference. And that's a field that actually Canada's gotten out of in the last 10 years. It uses tanks fundamentally because everybody is struggling with how to deal with the IDs, explosive devices, and the armor of the tanks actually protects the soldiers. And we've moved on to improve that. But what we have is what I would call, and nobody in Ottawa actually talks about it this way because it's taboo, we have a medium intensity, highly skilled combat force. And that's because that's the kind of theaters in which the Canadian forces are deployed.
What do you mean medium intensity?
For years and years, the politically correct expression was combat capable across the spectrum. We had to be able to do everything. And in fact, no military in the world can do everything, not even the United States. But it's a very hard discussion to have in this country. Now, if you actually look at what our forces can do, they're extraordinarily capable in the medium range. They are not, in fact, a war-fighting force at the highest degree of intensity. That's not what they're doing. That's not what they've trained for. That's not what they've cycled through over this last decade. So you have a very skilled, small, but mobile force that's really capable in the middle of the spectrum.
I think that's what we've seen, though. I mean, you're talking about a smaller force. No one expects us to have the numbers. Right. And in fact, the Americans are quite happy to bring in the bulk. They're the ones who have agreed to the surges and put the President Obama 20,000, then 30,000. Yeah. They know that. They're counting on our brains and our experience in this field because we're probably the most experienced people on the ground in Afghanistan.
Let me just do some business with the folks at home for a second, because while we're having this debate at the new Munk School of Global Affairs, I haven't said it wrong yet tonight, Janice. Good. So far, so good.
Absolutely. Good student.
You can enhance your enjoyment of tonight's program as well if you want to go online, tvo.org/theagenda. And Mike Miner, our fifth column blogger, is hosting a live chat there tonight. So by all means, weigh in with your comments, your questions. And after the broadcast is over at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll do a post-program live web chat. Our guests will stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes or so, and you can weigh in with your thoughts at that time. We'll put your questions to them. We'll do that online at tvo.org/theagenda once the program's off television at 9 Eastern Time. Let me read this that I suspect all of you saw this. Michael Valpy did a piece last month in the Globe and Mail. Not much more than a decade ago, he wrote, Canada's armed forces were all but invisible, out of sight in remote bases and discreetly dressed in civilian clothes in the city. Now, they march around Ottawa streets in combat gear. They have become the heroes of Middle Canada, celebrated at sporting events, re-mythologized as the new icons of nationalism and lionized by people such as Don Cherry, Rick Mercer, and Wayne Rostad. Both Mr. Mercer and Mr. Rostad have been appointed honorary colonels, along with former journalist and now Senator Pamela Wallin, and a clutch of some of the country's wealthiest business tycoons. Okay, Senator Wallin, how have public expectations changed, given all of this, about what our armed forces should be?
Well, I think we saw a change around the world in the time after 9/11. We started to look not only at our military folks that went to Afghanistan and on the American side to Iraq, but also the first responders, the firemen, people in uniform, all of a sudden became people to whom we really had to turn to help us out. We'd been living pretty safe, comfortable lives for a long time and not really paying attention. We saw the firemen, we saw the policemen go in and try to go through the wreckage of 9/11, of the towers. So it did start to change there. And when a military starts to do what it wants to do and what it's trained to do and what it thinks it's good at, it then becomes prouder itself. We'd had some bad incidents, in the previous decade about, the Somalia affair, those kinds of things. It was hard for soldiers in any of the forces to hold up their heads high because people were looking down their noses at them. This changed the calculation. So when Michael talks about folks, on the streets of Ottawa, you do see it. But I think that's what we should have. I think that's a more natural instinct for Canadians. We have this notion about somehow, peacekeeping was this pure activity in which no war fighting or guns were involved, that we just went off with blue berets and somehow magically made peace. Our guys, our women have been fighting in all of those circumstances. Sometimes they were ordered to put down their arms, but basically they were there in very difficult situations. And now this was an opportunity for us to say thank you and for them not to be embarrassed about what they do.
Others wanted to. David Bercuson, who I think also is an honorary officer, are you not?
Honorary Lieutenant Colonel, 41 Combat Engineer Regiment. I'm very proud of it. And I have to say, Michael Volpe probably doesn't go to Ottawa very much because I go there about 8, 9, 10 times a year, and I have never seen a soldier walking around, or a sailor, or an airman, or a woman in their combat gear. So it ain't happening. That's point one. Point two, the fact is that all of the major bases in the country are removed from all of the urban centers in the country. There's no military base anywhere near Toronto, or Montreal, or Vancouver, etc. So I'm not sure where he sees all these soldiers marching around in the cities. The fact is the military has more of a presence today than it had 10 or 15 years ago? Sure, but we're into an era of conflict. It began, as Senator Wallin said, with 9/11, and it's continued. I would say to Michael Volpe, what we're doing here, or what we're seeing here, is a resurgence of the awareness of Canadians that they have a military, and that they've had a strong military tradition dating back to the very birth of this country.
Which you think they may not have known or remembered?
I think it was forgotten, or deliberately forgotten, by certain elements in the country, mostly by governments in Ottawa in the 1960s and the 1970s. But it was the government of Jean Chrétien that established the unknown soldier. I think that, in a sense, began the new visibility of the Canadian forces in 2000, and it's just continued.
You live in Ottawa, so you can tell us.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that Michael Volpe, although I work right across the street from the National Defense Building, and I think Michael Volpe is using a little bit of artistic license. There's certainly a lot of soldiers walking around in their fatigues, not their combat gear, and there's actually a distinction. Thank goodness. I think what he's getting at, though, is this sense of pride in the Canadian Forces, which is there, and a sense of resurgent pride in the Canadian public in the armed forces. And there's no doubt that that's true, and that that's one of the outcomes of this Afghanistan mission. I think there's always been at least two traditions of thinking about our armed forces in this country. And one of them has been in abeyance for several years, even decades, and that is the kind of traditional view of the military force as a fighting force, the view that is represented by the National War Memorial in Ottawa, valor, sacrifice, bravery, victory. Another tradition is the peacekeeping tradition. And there's another monument in Ottawa. I see both of these monuments from my office window, by the way, and that's the Peacekeeping Memorial, which shows 3 soldiers, and none of them are holding their weapons in an aggressive fashion. One of them is looking through binoculars. And so these 2 traditions have been in our tradition now for decades. And what Afghanistan did is I think, take what was a somewhat diminished traditional view of the military as a fighting force and raise that up. But the peacekeeping view did not disappear. It's still very much here. There's a tension in the country's views.
No, it is there. My only comment is that we have this view that somehow peacekeepers are not soldiers in the way that we know it. And in most of the peacekeeping operations we've been in, and certainly going into any failed states that we may be going in ahead, even when we talk about a civilian operation in Afghanistan post-2011, you have to have security there, and the word security means a soldier.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because there was a period of about 20 years, 30 years when what we call classic peacekeeping existed. And I remember going to visit some of our peacekeepers in the Sinai Desert between Egypt and Israel, and they had a great volleyball net. They were playing volleyball in the desert, right? Because the likelihood of combat was 0. That was for a very brief period in our history.
When would that have been?
That was really began in the late 50s, lasted through the 60s until the 70s, and then finished. So we have to be very important not to take that brief period of our history, which was appropriate at that time given the way the world was structured, and stick the same label on it to describe something entirely different. There was one mission of that sort where an army separated 2 combatants, both armies, that's Ethiopia, Eritrea, in the last 25 years. So this is an artifact of history, frankly. There shouldn't be a debate.
I think that we're at risk of conflating 2 things here. I mean, one is admiration for troops, people that go out there, our fellow Canadians that are sign up and prepared to put their lives on the line. I think lots of people admire that. But don't conflate that with support with this particular mission or any mission or the combat that's going on out there. Canadians were also very proud that we did not go into Iraq. And I think that is something that we're forgetting. And I worry, Stephen, that pride that we have in the forces has been manipulated.
By?
Has been manipulated by special interests. For instance, I think it's been used by various, I mean, you can certainly see military folks walking around Ottawa. I'm on Spark Street. My office looks into the Prime Minister's office, and I can't walk down the street without falling over an arms lobbyist or somebody like that, because fortunes have been made.
Yes, they do.
Well, you get to, they're familiar after a while, David. You get to know them. They become have used this to get tremendous amount of money. I also think politically this has been important, where various political parties, and particularly the government, the Conservatives, have used this to try to rally their own base through the war and pride in this military mythology history that we have, in terms of trying to gain political points, use it against their opponents. They don't support the troops. If they don't agree with what the government is doing, you're not patriotic. And so this has been, this pride, which I think is well placed, has been manipulated.
You know, I have to say that's a little bit of a simplified view of the world. And it reminds me, when I hear that argument made.
You're being more diplomatic than I will be.
When I hear that argument made, I wonder if we ask about the performance of our Canadian athletes, right? And there's no question that if you compare the way the country feels about our Canadian athletes after Vancouver, it's very different than the way they felt the last Olympic Games. Now, I wonder, would we say that's manipulated by special interests? I mean, it's a stretch, right? And it seems to me, Steve, you're perilously close to making that kind of argument. The reason the Canadian forces are viewed very differently is throughout history, when your forces are fighting, the public feels a deep sense of obligation and respect for the people who are putting their lives at risk. And that's what we've seen in this country for the last decade.
No argument there.
Well, no. Steve is arguing that's manipulated for political purposes. I think that's the part of the argument that I find very, very difficult.
Okay. David?
I think it's important to understand that peacekeeping is something that we did in our national interests.
That's right.
in support of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and our allies. Two perfect examples, I think. One, Cyprus. Why did we intervene in Cyprus? Why did we do peacekeeping there? Because to have Greece and Turkey go to war against each other was to destroy NATO's southern flank. Why did we go into Sinai in the first place? Because Britain and the United States and France were all at odds in 1956. I think that's very, very important. So that's one. Second, most of what we did during that period was not peacekeeping. It was waiting for the Russians to attack across the Fulda Gap. It never happened, thank God, but that's what most of our armed forces were devoted to. And the third thing is that if you want competent peacekeepers, you need trained soldiers who can deal with any contingency as it arises.
Well, let's pick up on that, because Afghanistan will soon be over, and lots of smart people are now starting to ask the question, okay, what next? What should our priorities be going forward after 2011 takes place? Roland Paris, why don't you start us off on that? The dust is settling on the Afghan mission. What should the key priorities of our armed forces be going forward?
Well, I think the no-brainer is, just to start with and hopefully to set this aside, that the primary mandate for our armed forces should be to protect the territory and airspace and waterways surrounding Canada and to cooperate with the Americans in protecting the continent. The really interesting question...
From whom, can I just say?
Oh, from there have been people who have...
you don't want here, who is not coming here with your permission.
I mean,
period.
It's a fair question, but I mean, the Russians are not exactly posing a threat of nuclear attack upon North America, but the Russians continue to probe the airspace. We have to have a mechanism in order to be able to monitor the airspace. There have been cases of people hijacking planes. And in terms of maritime surveillance, that's clearly something that we need as well.
And our north.
And the north.
Yeah.
The really interesting question for me is, what is that overseas role? I think to broaden the question even further, some people might say that there shouldn't be any overseas role. I disagree with that entirely.
Maybe I guess the basic options that people are considering right now is, do we want to go back to peacekeeping, quote unquote?
That's not an option, Steve.
Hang on. Let me just say, or are we really in the we're in war now business?
Well,
It's a false debate. It's not either or. You can do two things, and you need the same people, as David says, to do those jobs.
If we're about to go into a decade of retrenched funding, can we really do everything we want to do?
No, what you Gillier said we couldn't do
it. You can't do peacekeeping without the training that David talks about. We don't find a different group of people to send to a peacekeeping mission. Now, I think one of the things we have learned out of Afghanistan is this whole connection between the civilian and the military. And the military have learned it very well. And the civilian side needs to come up to speed on that, to how to work, how to function with another group. These are not, natural couples to have, diplomats from foreign affairs and warfighters standing there. But the soldiers have had to create the civilian space for them, so they've learned a lot about that. And now I think we need to, send some of our civilian folks in greater numbers into those areas so that we're really creating a class of people that know how to do it.
Priorities going forward, what would you like to see?
Well, Stephen, there's three priorities, three missions for the military, as Roland mentioned: defense of Canada, and I think we've been lacking in some of those areas. In particular, while we've been out writing big checks for fleets of aircraft and tanks and everything, fixed-wing search and rescue on our own west coast continues to get pushed down the list. So I think there's some priorities right here in North America. In terms of NORAD, we did not join missile defense. That was a great debate. Lots of people said if we don't join Bush's missile defense, NORAD will cease to exist. Not true. NORAD is doing fine. I think that's covered. The third one is international contribution to peace and security. And I'm delighted that so many experts out there now are looking seriously at a return to UN peacekeeping, because it is a real part of our history.
But you're saying that and that's it, as opposed to anything else?
I think we need to increase our contribution to the United Nations, and I think that's what Canadians.
Steve,
some of the statements just aren't based in facts, so we do have to take that on.
Which facts are you equivalent with?
Well, several of them. I don't want to go back and reopen this whole thing, but I don't think that we can insult the intelligence of Canadians by saying that somehow they're all being manipulated by a political party to feel good about their soldiers. I mean, I think that's because soldiers are their sons and daughters and their nieces and their nephews and their husbands and their wives.
Let's just be correct. They're taking that admiration that they have for the military and using it for their own interests.
The other issue about going to the north, I've just come back from spending some time at Base Elmendorf, which is the NORAD base in Alaska, where in fact we do deal with Russian incursions, and no, I don't think the nuclear bomb's coming over the top of the earth anytime soon. But those issues concern us, and we are going to have to focus on some issues of northern security, because the waterway is opening up, and so there's going to be lots of people coming in, and we do have to know who they are.
These three wanted to. Roland, then David, then Janice.
Let me partially agree with Steve, because I think that we do need to seriously reconsider renewing Canada's involvement and participation in and contribution to UN peace missions. The UN, as a label, continues to call many of those missions peacekeeping missions. But I encourage everyone, including your viewers, just to go to the Peacekeeping Operations website of the United Nations and read the first page where it says peacekeeping has been transformed. So we have been absent from the UN missions for a very long time. We should reconsider that. But let's be very clear. They are not the peacekeeping missions of the 1960s and the 1970s. They are totally transformed, and they range from insecure to very insecure.
So you want to go to the Congo?
Well, the second part,
combat mission.
Well, the second part of the answer is that when we're talking about what specific missions we might want to engage, the question isn't really where should our military go. The question is, what should Canada be doing overseas? The military is one instrument of our foreign policy. In my own view, when you are considering one mission or another, whether it's a Congo or anywhere else, you got to ask some pretty clear questions every time. Is it important for strategic reasons, for humanitarian reasons, whatever the case may be? Is there a need for what we can provide as a country? And that includes both our civilian and our military resources. And third, what is the plan to end the mission?
Exit strategy.
And in the case of the Congo, it's certainly important. There is probably a role for Canada, but this is a very bad time in the Congo to be talking about what the plan is.
And the leadership
it's quite
there
uncertain.
says don't come.
Another question, what can we actually do? What are our capabilities?
Do you think we should hit the Congo?
No, I don't, because it's a logistical, about peacekeeping?
Yeah, has he asked the right questions about whether we should?
Well, I think the other question that needs to be asked is what are our capabilities? Right. I don't think we have any capability to go into the Congo and be effective today. We've been training for a high desert type of mission, Afghanistan counterinsurgency now. We've sunk millions and millions of dollars into training for that sort of thing. You can't turn your military around tomorrow. But one of the points I wanted to make was Steve keeps talking about all the big checks that we're writing for equipment. Okay, when we had the tsunami in Southeast Asia, I can't remember, 5, 6, 7 years ago, where everybody asked is the disaster assistance response team. How come we can't get there and help these folks? Well, today, a couple of months ago, we were in Haiti within 72 hours. What was the difference? Several $1 billion on 4 huge military transports that we own, that carry the flag of Canada on their tail, and which brought this stuff into Haiti. But when it came to the tsunami area, we had no way of getting it there. And you couldn't ask Ivan to send his rented Antonovs to you because everybody else in the world had already chartered them.
We did try to hitchhike over there.
Well, exactly. We had the yellow telephone at National Defense Headquarters. Instead of calling a taxi, you call Antonov's Ivanov taxi service. So the point is that much of the equipment which is used for war fighting, war preparation, or logistics for combat is also absolutely necessary for disaster response.
You know, it would be a great thing if the rest of the show and permanently we could ban the word peacekeeping, okay? And we could talk about should we participate in UN missions, right? Because when we use that word peacekeeping, it just obscures. They're not peacekeeping missions. Anybody who thinks that the Congo mission is a peacekeeping mission, where you have UN troops engaged in fight after fight after fight on the ground with militia, and we talk about that as a peacekeeping mission, it misleads the public.
No peace to keep, is that what you're saying?
That's right, there's no peace to keep in 90%, and that's what Roland's referring to.
Afghanistan is also a UN mission. That's the other thing. These are not either or.
The example of Haiti and the tsunami, that's a different kind of operation. That is what we call an emergency assistance operation. It requires capabilities, and David is right, that we take out of the general capabilities of the military and the core capabilities, Steve. We have to move people quickly, because it's those first 36 hours that are really crucial on the ground. Well, that's not a peacekeeping mission. Look at Haiti, one last point. The real problem with Haiti, and it became very, very clear, we had a terrible, terrible logistical obstacles in the delivery of humanitarian assistance You know why? There weren't enough soldiers to deploy in a rapid enough
And we had
way.
to pull most of them out. So
Let me ask Senator
the
Wall,
disaster's still
can you
there.
give us a better understanding of the kinds of conversations that are going on at the highest levels of government in Ottawa right now about what our potential contribution in Congo might be, should be?
Well, I'm not convinced that, for all of the reasons that everybody's already cited, that Congo is on anybody's short list at this time. There's a lot of discussion that's going around, but it's the same people who are involved in the discussion, I think, for precisely the reason. We don't have the right stuff to go there, and I don't mean that in the human, I mean the kit, the physical equipment. And they do match, as David says. When I happened to be out at Trenton when our troops were getting ready to go into Haiti, and they're putting, you know, a Griffin helicopter that we use to take our soldiers up off the roads where they're having their legs blown off from IEDs in those helicopters, and we can now put that in a C-17 because it's big enough to put one in.
So it sounds like the future then is more Afghanistan-type missions or rescue missions in the event of earthquakes and this kind of thing?
I think we want to come back to Janice's point, which let's talk about UN operations and NATO operations, and I suppose we might even from time to time think about coalition of the willing operations. But Canada almost always goes through, and Afghanistan
Always,
is a
100%.
yes, 100%. Afghanistan is a UN-sponsored, NATO-run, NATO-led operation.
And
that's
therefore
what
we
it
were there.
is.
Roland Paris.
Well, I think that we have to be careful because if you look at the more than 20 major UN operations that have been conducted since the end of the Cold War, all of them with Chapter 7 mandates, in other words, authorized to use force, they have really ranged in terms of the degree of insecurity. And none of them is, or at least perhaps with the exception of the Congo, none of them has been quite as intense in terms of combat as Afghanistan.
No,
so I do not think that Afghanistan is the model. Neither is Cyprus in 1970 the model.
So what's the
There
new
is
model?
a spot. There is a spectrum. There is a spectrum. So if you think about El Salvador in the 1990s, or Mozambique or Namibia, we don't hear a lot about those. Why? Because they were relatively successful peacemaking missions that didn't explode in renewed violence. We hear a lot about Rwanda in 1994 because it was a very intense failure. So the other thing that we can really contribute is on the civilian side, and we don't. That doesn't get a lot of attention, but there's been a chronic shortage in UN missions of civilian experts who are always deployed along these missions too. I'll give you a specific example, and that's the UN African Union mission in Darfur, authorized in 2007, authorized for 1,500 civilians. That's people who are acting as technical advisors, legal advisors, sanitation advisors, and the like. A year later, they only had 500 of those spots filled. There's a desperate shortage, and we can, as a country, not only contribute experts, but we can really help to train experts from other countries.
Stand
and not
by
just
1 second.
civilians, military as well.
Stand by, everybody. I got to do some business at home. And remind everybody, we're at the Munk School for Global Affairs of Global Affairs. Close. Munk School of Global Affairs tonight, the newly rechristened former Munk Center for International Studies, where Janice Stein runs the show here. We're talking about what's next after Afghanistan for Canada's military. We're on television until 9 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. A reminder that if you go online now to tvo.org/theagenda, Mike Miner is hosting a discussion about this very issue on his Fifth Column blog, so go and weigh in there. And then after 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we invite you to send us your, you can start doing it now, but after 9 Eastern Time, online on the website, we'll take your comments and questions for our guest here tonight. So you can enhance your appreciation of the broadcast tonight by doing that. Janice.
Yeah, I wonder if I could make a provocative statement.
Sure, please. You can do whatever you want.
We've deployed, relatively speaking, very few civilians. We've had trouble filling our civilian quota on Afghanistan year after year. And there are some absolutely extraordinary people on the civilian side that most of us know. But nevertheless, I think the argument that we've done well at integrating the civilian and the military in this mission is over-exaggerated. It is still a struggle to this day, 10 years into it, to get that kind of civilian-military integration. We haven't learned that much. And from that perspective, when we talk about all the expertise that we have to offer to the world, there's a little bit of myth-making going on here.
But certainly not on the side of, I mean, I agree with you to a certain extent, but we've gone from 0 to 60. We may not have gone from 0 to 120.
That's it. Everything's relative.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the kind of joint Kandahar action plan that was developed in late 2008, early 2009. It was done jointly by the civilians and the military in Kandahar. So there's still a huge way to go. But compared to the way it was before.
But to Roland's point, but on the mentoring and the training, which our soldiers do really well, and which they can take that expertise and move it. They are mentoring Afghan troops, both Army and police, but more particularly the Army, and they're working with them, and they're teaching, and they're creating leadership, and they're talking about command and control. That skill and that ability to educate, that's transportable. That may be part of a UN mission that we are part of.
While you have the floor, let me quote you. You wrote a piece in the National Post, actually, last fall, where you said, despite genuine concerns, few Canadians want to revert to our status as spectator nation because our troops have shown us how our military resources and humanitarian spirit can be harnessed and effectively deployed to shape a participant role for Canada for the 21st century. Everybody's, of course, very proud of the troops. What evidence is there that you can show us that Canadians, 10 years after Afghanistan, still have an appetite for going around the world into very dangerous places and, if necessary, killing lots of bad people?
Two things. I think that we see the spikes and the dips in polls depending on what is being discussed. We've got a real problem with how this story is being seen in Canada because the restrictions on the media, not by the military, but by their own economics, the cost of insurance, all of those things. We've seen most of our reporters stay inside the wire, as they say in Afghanistan. So the only stories that Canadians see are really fallen soldiers coming home. And any fallen soldier story lasts for 5 days. We hear the story in Afghanistan. We see their body leave Afghanistan. We see the body arrive here. Then we go to the hometown. Okay, but while that is going on, you don't see these other stories. I was there last November for Remembrance Day. Spending a couple of days with the families of the fallen who had come back and were, making peace with the loss of a loved one and seeking closure, whatever phrase you want to use. Those people are parts of communities that have supported them and embraced what we are doing. It's not just that you can say you like your soldiers, but you don't support the mission. I think that's a false dichotomy. I think you either believe that you have a military that sometimes does things that puzzle you or maybe even trouble you, or you wonder why we're there. I think that kind of issue is our inability in terms of political people to tell the story properly, because they can't.
David Bercuson, the fact that Parliament voted to have our troops leave in 2011, does that not suggest
didn't vote that.
An exhaustion with being overseas?
But they didn't vote that. They voted to deploy out of Kandahar province. That was the vote.
To deploy the combat capability.
Right. So there was no long-term answer given in 2008 as to what we would do outside of Kandahar province. And by the way, it also said that when we left Kandahar province, we would be replaced by the Afghan National Army. Right. Well, where's the Afghan National Army?
It's taking a little longer.
Yeah, they're not there. I think the real question is what is coming down the road, and the answer is nobody knows, because you're never prepared for political conflict. You're never prepared for war. Every time there's a new one that develops, that explodes on the scene, you try to repeat old patterns, but you realize that you've got to learn something new. Every single time, there's no repeat of one conflict and another conflict. How much of a flexibility do you want to build into the military? That's the question.
Stephen.
I would think that most Canadians would be a little alarmed to hear that somehow our military is not able to do UN peacekeeping anymore, or is ill-equipped for that, because I think that's what Canadians really want the military to do, because that was precisely the concern that going into Afghanistan may be, the fact that we're trying to change Afghanistan, but Afghanistan may end up changing us in some ways. I know in talking to instructors in the Canadian Forces, they've been concerned that peace building and peacekeeping courses were replaced a number of years ago by three-block war doctrine that was imported from the U.S. and counterinsurgency, exactly the kind of thing that we're worried about. So we may need to go back and relearn some of those skills of doing peacekeeping, because peacekeeping actually takes additional training beyond that of combat.
But
it's not less than combat.
Are you using peacekeeping
it's more
Where is that in
One at a time, please,
I
David.
want to know if you're using peacekeeping as a camouflage for some sort of a situation where we sit back and we fold our arms and we say, we refuse to get involved in these things that are happening around the world that endanger our interests or endanger our citizens. You know darn well that there are no Chapter 6 peacekeeping operations going on out there right now. You know that.
I think
None.
what Canadians are looking for is to ensure that the mission is legitimate, that it has
Does that mean
international
just different
consensus
by the
on it.
UN?
Let's hear him out.
I think that it's not exclusively the United Nations, but that is very, very important
But
to
the
Canadians.
Afghanistan mission was.
But it's not a blue beret mission, and I think we all know that there's difference between UN endorsed, which comes from the Security Council, and UN led, which is a blue helmet mission. And it's true.
So you're
They
asking
have
only for
conformed,
UN
they
led
have
with blue
trained.
helmets. Is
I
that
think
right?
UN-led missions are
So
better
name
than
one.
those
Name one.
that are not.
Name
I
one
think
in the
that
world today.
I think the Congo should be
But they're
looked
not
at
blue berets.
carefully.
Blue beret.
I think that the Department of UN Peacekeeping Operations, which leads these, has certain requirements about countries that are involved in
But
it, and I
Stephen,
think that's what
but that's
Canadians
not
want.
a blue beret. I mean, that's the whole point. That the one that you're citing is not a blue beret
I think
operation.
Canadians are prepared.
But you're
for
talking about a
troops to be-
fictional world.
No,
Yeah.
I think Canadians
Stand
are
by.
prepared to involve in combat, and we know that Congo does involve combat.
Roland
It
Paris.
does, but
It
it's
does.
what
Roland,
what
time
do
out,
we find
everybody.
for?
Roland Paris.
You know, I think that Canadians, Steve is articulating an important strand in Canadian public opinion,
Yes.
and I think it's important that he have the opportunity to articulate it. I think that people have part of the wrenching experience of Afghanistan for a lot of Canadians has been learning that the peacekeeping idea is no longer applicable in the world as it is today. That being said, there is an important role for the United Nations. Not running high-intensity missions. We learned in Somalia, in Bosnia, and elsewhere. The UN itself learned that it's not the organization to actually run high-intensity military operations. But Canadians, I think, are legitimately concerned about making sure that Canadian forces are involved in operations that are legitimate. And one of the biggest stamps of approval in the world, if not the biggest stamp of approval, is the UN Security Council. But you can get that stamp without necessarily having a UN-run mission, and you certainly don't want to be sending blue helmets into a place like Kandahar. They'd be picked off in a second.
I think this is a very important point, because it is so important not to mislead the Canadian public. The Congo Mission, which is being debated in Ottawa, at least by some people, and General Leslie, our former commander of the Canadian Army, has been
Still is commander.
Still about to end his term, is a candidate, one of the several candidates to take command of that UN authorized, UN-led mission, which requires combat capability because soldiers are getting killed. It is not a blue beret mission, and there is not a single UN-led and UN-run blue beret mission today. What's important, and I think this is the strain that you're tapping into, Roland, if you ask Canadians, do you want to use your armed forces to make the world a better place? Do you want to use your armed forces to help people in distress? Do you want to use your armed forces to prevent a genocide? Do you want to use your armed forces to provide emergency relief? You will get unequivocal yes. So the question for people then who are looking at these issues, what capabilities, what military capabilities do we need to do that?
Okay, let's get a question from the floor, please. Hi.
This question's for the whole panel. I mean, there's been lots of great points about, what good things our military is doing, how the Canadian public feels about it. One thing that Steve was kind of pointing at is, these things cost a lot of money.
Yes,
Where does the financial kind of consideration come into this? And, how does that, impact what is going to be going on and what is our priorities for our military going forward?
Let me get Steve to start on that, because your organization, you helped author a study which determined that we spent $21 billion last year on national defense. Have I got that right?
Well, sure. I mean, that comes from the government's own documents, their military spending estimates, and we do track military spending in terms of dollars and GDP. It's a good question, because all of this there's dollars competing here. The government has to look at all kinds of different priorities of where to put their money, whether it's going to be on this priority or that priority, or whether it's going to be on the military. And there's only one taxpayer, as we're reminded. But the fact is, the Department of National Defense spending has risen precipitously. We now spend more in adjusted dollars than we did at the height of the Cold War. In terms of real dollars, we're the 6th highest in NATO and about 13th highest in the world. And even in terms of GDP, we spend roughly the same as Germany and Japan.
Roland,
so Canada does spend a lot of money. The budget's been going up about 10% a year. And even in this age of restraint, the military budget is planning to still go up.
They're not going to get 10% a year in this.
No, they're not.
They might get 7 or 8.
I think it's a very good question. It's always legitimate and important to ask the question about guns versus butter. But the fact is that we spend about 1.3% of GDP on military, and that's about half the average in NATO. Like Steve said, it's about the same as Germany and Norway, not exactly the most militaristic countries, less than Italy, a lot less than France. I don't know if 1.3 is the magic number, but it's not huge by comparison to our allies.
But that's a percentage of GDP. I really think you have to look at real dollars being spent there, because you have to look at what we are.
That's the fair comparison of you.
If you want to compare across NATO, you have to look at percentage of GDP. Absolutely. But let's add in one other factor, and it's actually a very interesting question. There were deep cuts to the military budget when we went through the last recession and constrained spending. And already, as the Harper government begins to talk about an exit strategy from stimulus spending, there is discussion about reductions to military spending. One of the things you have to look at over time with respect to military spending is capital equipment, the things that soldiers need, take a long lead time. They can take up to a decade depending on what you're talking about.
15 years for a ship.
So you get this whipsaw, right? In a period of constraint, you cut back and you cut off the purchase lines for the military equipment that you need 10 years later. And then you find yourself where you get this burst of spending as you're ready to deploy your forces, and they have inadequate kit. So there's a fundamental irrationality in this whipsawing of military spending.
Over here, please, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
I just want to first say that I am a student who goes to school in Ottawa, and there you do, in fact, see quite a lot of soldiers in fatigues these days. My question, in regards to one of the larger difficulties of the Afghan mission, especially in the last couple of years, has been the question of reliability of the allies on the ground there, in particular the Karzai government. Moving into future missions, be they in the Congo or elsewhere, what is something that Canada can do both militarily and diplomatically to ensure that the countries or the governments and the forces that we're working with on the ground are reliable and can be trusted?
David, you want to start on that one?
Yeah. I think it's one of the conditions that you lay down, and it's not a condition that you can always stick to, but one of the conditions that you lay down is what's the reliability of the ally that you're trying to protect? There are many others. Can you do the mission? I mean, Roland went through a whole list of them. Certainly one of the questions is the question that you ask. A real answer in the real world is that no one's perfect. And in the parts of the world where we're going, I mean, we're not being asked to do peace enforcement operations in Europe. We're going to places that are pretty bad, as I keep reminding people. Afghanistan isn't Ontario, which is one of the reasons why we're there. So sometimes you have to deal with people on your side who are far from perfect. I think you draw the line when it comes to outright abuses of human rights and so on and so forth, but there are no perfect allies.
No perfect allies, but is Karzai good enough?
He's
a good enough partner?
I think Karzai is a really poor leader from our perspective. I think the question is, can Karzai get the job done for us? That's the key.
What's the answer?
I don't know.
I don't know. I just don't know.
You don't get to pick your allies. We did not know that the people who were going to fly into the Twin Towers, again, we didn't know that was going to happen, would have had their base in Afghanistan, and that 10 years back we could have predicted that and planned and made sure that we didn't send our soldiers in without any equipment and the wrong gear. We went in green camouflage into a desert area. So you don't get to pick them. And I think Karzai has not proved to be what everybody hoped and wanted him to be. But that's not our choice. Whether we like the way they do elections or not, lots of people don't like the way we do them or the Americans do them.
But presumably
he has been elected, and they will have to deal with that. What would happen if the Americans or the Canadians or NATO went in there and said, you know what, you guys had your elections and we've been telling you about the importance of democracy, but we've changed our mind. We're going to pick a new guy because we'd like to deal with him instead of the one you picked. We can't do that.
Well, it's not. I hear what you're saying on that, but is it an option for the Canadian government to say, you know what, you've lied to us, you have been corrupt,
but our leaders
you've
are
broken
saying
your promises,
that. Barack Obama's
and so
saying
we're
it.
going home.
And Stephen Harper,
option?
no, but I don't think you say we're going home because we don't like you. We're saying if you don't hit certain benchmarks, if you don't do certain things, if you don't help us get the Army trained at a faster rate, if you don't support some of these things, then our support will diminish over time because we're not going to stay here forever if you don't want to cooperate.
You know, I actually think the government of Afghanistan is a severe disappointment.
Yes, it is.
And I think you reach a point where you have to ask whether the sacrifice of Canadian lives for a government that fundamentally misbehaves, even within its own remit. That's a question, and I think your question is a really great question. That's a question that the Canadian public is entitled to ask, and our Prime Minister is asking it, frankly. But let me think forward a little bit. Sudan, right, which has had some of the worst ethnic fighting and a war that has killed over 2 million people over 20 years. There's a referendum coming up in Sudan in which the South will vote whether or not to secede next January. And already there is a prospect of some bloody fighting that will go on in Sudan. The government of Sudan, central Khartoum, is Bashir, who's been indicted by the International Criminal Court. Does this country, anticipating violence, ethnic conflict, killing, and requiring real combat capability, should this country send its forces into Sudan to prevent that?
Well, that would be the question in Congo, Janice, because
the government
the leader
is even
doesn't
worse
want us,
in
and
Sudan.
Stephen.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't believe my ears a little bit because Karzai stole the election last summer, and it is a fact that we all know it, the panel knows it, the audience knows it, all Afghans know what happened. But it's a fact that we've been trying to paper over because it's a huge problem. It's a massive problem that we've invested all this money, all these troops and all these lives that are there, and we do not have a reliable partner. And it's not just the fact that, gee, gosh, we wish he was better. The fact is that this is a battle really about hearts and minds in that country.
David.
And we're seen as supporting a corrupt government.
We don't like it one bit because it doesn't appeal to our liberal democratic consciences about the way the world ought to be run. But I don't think most Afghans, quite frankly, give a damn. I think what they're really interested in is not being blown up when they go to the marketplace, or not having their girls have acid thrown in their face when they go to they want security above all. And if this guy is a petty tin pot corrupt dictator who happens to bring them security, they're going to support him eventually, not because he's not corrupt, but because he's bringing them what they want.
2 minutes to go. Roland Paris.
Well, I think, I think that I have to disagree with David. All the indications are that Afghans do care about the degree of corruption in their society.
You think they care more about corruption than they do about security?
I think they care about both.
Yeah.
And in fact, in practice, the problem in the past has been that the Taliban has been able to provide a version of governance which is absolutely brutal and which is rejected in its brutality and its extremity by most Afghans, but which is fair, at least in a consistent sense. It's not corrupt, and it provides security. Fair. Now, that is a terrible,
you have to be really careful about your words there, because
fair to women?
No.
In the sense that it is not corrupt. Only in the sense that it is not corrupt. There was no corruption. And if you go, as you have been to Kandahar, sit down with Kandaharis and they'll tell you again and again that there was no corruption during Taliban time. Does that mean that they want
bribes?
They weren't taking bribes. Does that mean Does that mean they want Taliban back? No, they don't. But let's be very clear. The quality or the lack of quality of governance in that country is a serious problem. That's what Afghan people say.
What you've seen the Afghans do is move, as people do even in democracies like ours, turn to their local government or government that's closer to them, just shiras. That's what the allies and who the allies have been dealing with in the different provinces across the, and that's how we're making some progress in spite of the problem.
Last 30 seconds to Steve.
We talk about security, and I'm very concerned, Stephen, that right now in Afghanistan, U.S. and Canadian troops and others are preparing for a major assault on Kandahar city itself this summer. It's a new operation that they're going to be going into, and people are worried. The local people are very concerned about this. A much smaller operation last year in Helmand displaced 40,000 people. Families were pushed off their homes. They couldn't eat. There's no relief for these folks. So that's the kind of violence. We also own some of that violence that we're going to do in this push this summer that is going to turn people against us.
Okay, that's the last word. That's to be continued online, actually. Don't go anywhere, everybody, because we're not quite done tonight. Thank you for doing the broadcast part of the program. To our esteemed panelists here tonight, David especially coming all the way in from Alberta. We're grateful. Thanks to our audience for coming out tonight. And we want to remind everybody that tonight's program was produced by Daniel Kitts. Nicely done, Daniel. Thank you very much. For more information on tonight's guests and to read 2 reports on Canada's role in NATO's new strategic concept, please visit us on the homepage, tvo.org/the agenda, where in just a few moments we're going to start our live post-program web chat with tonight's guests, so please stay tuned for that. Stay with us. We're back with a preview of what's on the agenda tomorrow night, right after this.
Next time on Empire of the Word, the reader's journey comes to an end in a universe of possibilities.
A lot of writers are afraid that the book will disappear.
We have all these books that are in a physical form, and we need to transform them into some electronic representation.
Is this the dawn of a new enlightenment or the beginning of a modern dark age?
Once everything is digitized, what stops school from then deciding we're going to excise that?
Don't miss the final episode of Empire of the Word, Sunday night at 8.
Funding for the agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Vale Inco Limited, a pioneering nickel mining company transforming mineral resources into essential ingredients for everyday life. Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at casforchange.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, April 29th, 2010. Tomorrow night, Behind the Veil of hockey and hijab author Shima Khan will join us to reflect on her life as a Muslim Canadian woman. And the University of Montreal's Marie McAndrew will be here to talk about recent efforts to ban the burqa in the province of Quebec. I'm Steve Paikin. See you again in 2 minutes at tvo.org for our post-program web chat. Thanks, everyone.